In the autumn of 1944, something remarkable happened in the rolling countryside of eastern France that would challenge every assumption about armoured warfare. The German military had unleashed what they believed would be a devastating counter-offensive in Lorraine, bringing forward hundreds of their most feared weapon, the Panther tank. These machines represented the cutting edge of German engineering, formidable predators that had earned their reputation on battlefields from Russia to Normandy. Against them stood American forces equipped with Sherman tanks, vehicles that had been criticized and questioned throughout the war for their apparent inadequacies. What transpired over those foggy September days would become one of the war's most instructive examples of how battles are truly won. The German High Command had assembled approximately 300 armoured vehicles for this operation, placing enormous faith in the technical superiority of their Panthers. These tanks mounted the fearsome 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun, a weapon capable of penetrating enemy armour at distances exceeding 2,000 metres. Their frontal armour, sloped and thick, had been designed specifically to deflect the shells fired by Allied tanks. On paper, the mathematics of the encounter seemed brutally simple. A Panther could destroy a Sherman from ranges where the American tank's gun was virtually useless. At 1,000 yards, a Sherman's 75mm shell would simply bounce off the angled German armour. The crews climbing into those olive-painted American tanks understood this terrible calculus intimately. Yet when the fighting finally ended and commanders tallied the wreckage scattered across those French fields, the results defied all expectations. The landscape was littered not with burning American vehicles, but with the destroyed hulks of German armour. Somehow, against all the predictions made by technical specifications and armour thickness charts, the Americans had achieved a victory so lopsided that it shocked observers on both sides. Understanding how this happened requires examining not just the hardware involved, but the men who operated it, the doctrine that guided them, and the circumstances that shaped the battle. The weather that descended upon Lorraine in mid-September proved to be one of the defining factors of the engagement. Dense fog rolled across the valleys and hills, reducing visibility to mere yards in many places. This atmospheric condition transformed the battlefield in ways that neither side had fully anticipated. The German planners had hoped the fog would conceal their advance, allowing their armoured columns to achieve surprise and close with American positions before facing coordinated resistance. American units, spread across the region in what were essentially defensive positions, found themselves wrapped in the same obscuring mist. Men peered into whiteness, straining to hear the approach of enemy engines, unable to see more than the vague outlines of nearby buildings or trees. The broader strategic situation in France by September 1944 had created the conditions for this confrontation. Following the breakout from Normandy in late summer, Allied forces had pursued retreating German armies across hundreds of miles of French territory. General George Patton's Third Army had been at the forefront of this pursuit, racing eastward with an aggressiveness that had become his trademark. His armoured divisions had covered ground at speeds that seemed to promise a rapid penetration into Germany itself. But this spectacular advance had come at a cost. Supply lines stretched thin across the distance from Normandy. Fuel became increasingly scarce as the logistics system struggled to keep pace with the forward units. Ammunition stocks dwindled. The High Command was channeling available resources northward to support Field Marshal Montgomery's operations aimed at securing the approaches to the Rhine River. For Hitler and the German leadership, Lorraine represented more than just another piece of French territory to be contested. The region guarded the approaches to the Saar industrial basin, an area of immense importance to Germany's war production. Should American forces break through here, they would threaten the German homeland directly. More than that, the German dictator had become increasingly desperate to demonstrate that his armies could still strike effective blows against the advancing Allies. He demanded counterattacks, offensive actions that might slow or reverse the seemingly inexorable Allied advance. The summer of 1944 had seen the Wehrmacht suffer catastrophic losses on multiple fronts. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet summer offensive had shattered Army Group Center. In the West, the Normandy campaign had cost Germany hundreds of thousands of casualties and vast amounts of equipment. Hitler's response to these disasters was to order the creation of new panzer brigades, hastily assembled formations that would restore Germany's offensive capability. These newly formed brigades reflected both the desperation and the delusion that characterized German military planning in this period. They were equipped with Panthers, certainly, and the tank itself remained a formidable weapon. But the human element had deteriorated catastrophically. The Eastern Front had consumed Germany's experienced tankers by the thousands. The men now being assigned to these new units were young, inadequately trained, and unfamiliar with their equipment. Many had received only weeks of instruction before being thrown into combat. Their officers, too, often lacked experience in coordinating large armoured formations. The institutional knowledge that had made the Panzerwaffe so effective in the war's early years had been bled away in the vast spaces of Russia. The 5th Panzer Army, under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, received orders to execute the Lorraine counter-offensive. Manteuffel was a capable officer, but he understood the limitations of the forces at his disposal. Nevertheless, orders from Berlin demanded action, and so the attack was prepared. The plan called for massing the new panzer brigades and driving them toward the town of Lunéville, aiming to sever Patton's spearheads and force an American retreat back across the Moselle River. On paper, the concentration of armour seemed impressive. In reality, the units were plagued by fuel shortages, inadequate reconnaissance, and the inexperience of their crews. On the American side, the situation looked quite different. Patton's Third Army contained multiple armoured divisions, but the unit that would bear the brunt of the German attack was the 4th Armoured Division under Major General John Wood. This division had been training together since 1941, an eternity in wartime. Its men had fought through Normandy, had learned hard lessons in the hedgerows, and had developed the cohesion that only comes from shared combat. They understood their equipment intimately, knew its strengths, and accepted its limitations. The division's organization reflected American doctrine, which emphasized combined arms coordination rather than relying on tanks alone. American tankers had no illusions about their Shermans. They knew the vehicle's weaknesses as well as anyone. The armour was thin compared to German heavy tanks. The 75mm gun, while adequate against many targets, lacked the penetrating power to reliably defeat a Panther's frontal armour. These were facts that could not be argued away. But the American approach to armoured warfare had evolved to compensate for these deficiencies. Tanks were not expected to fight alone. They operated in close coordination with infantry, artillery, and increasingly with aircraft. Doctrine emphasized maneuver, flanking attacks, and the use of terrain to negate enemy advantages. American commanders had learned to create situations where their numerical superiority and better coordination could overwhelm technically superior German equipment. The Sherman itself deserves consideration in understanding what happened at Arracourt. American factories had produced these tanks in staggering numbers, more than 40,000 over the course of the war. This mass production was possible precisely because the design prioritized simplicity and reliability over maximum armor or firepower. The tank was relatively easy to maintain in field conditions. Its mechanical reliability meant that units could count on having most of their vehicles operational at any given time, a stark contrast to German tanks that often suffered from mechanical failures. The Sherman's size and weight made it easier to transport across oceans and over bridges. It consumed less fuel than heavier German tanks, a significant advantage given the logistics challenges of modern warfare. The interior was relatively spacious, making crew comfort and efficiency better than in many comparable vehicles. Most importantly, the Sherman's gun, while not ideal for penetrating heavy armour frontally, was perfectly adequate for engaging targets from the side or rear. German tanks, despite their impressive frontal protection, remained vulnerable from other angles. The key was creating tactical situations where American tanks could attack these vulnerable points. This required maneuver, coordination, and patience, qualities that the veteran crews of the 4th Armoured Division possessed in abundance. By contrast, the Panther, for all its technical merits, brought significant complications. The tank was expensive and time-consuming to produce, limiting numbers. Its weight strained bridges and roads. The engine and transmission were prone to failures, especially when operated by inexperienced crews who might not understand the proper techniques for handling the vehicle. The complex suspension required regular maintenance that was difficult to provide in combat conditions. German logistics were already stretched thin by 1944, and keeping Panthers operational in the field proved increasingly difficult. More crucially, the tank required a trained crew to realize its potential. In the hands of veterans, a Panther was deadly. In the hands of recruits who had barely learned to drive it, the tank became a vulnerable, complicated machine that often failed its operators at critical moments. The doctrine governing how these machines would be employed differed fundamentally between the two armies. German armoured doctrine in 1944 still clung to concepts developed during the early Blitzkrieg years. The emphasis remained on massed armoured thrusts, breakthrough attacks that would shatter enemy lines through shock and firepower. This approach had worked brilliantly in Poland, France, and initially in Russia, but by 1944 the conditions that had made it effective no longer existed. Germany lacked the fuel for sustained mobile operations. Air superiority had passed entirely to the Allies, making daylight movements hazardous. Most critically, the quality of German units had declined precipitously as casualties mounted and training time shortened. American doctrine had matured through hard experience. The battles in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy had taught expensive lessons about the realities of modern combat. The American military had developed a system that integrated all available arms into a cohesive whole. Artillery could be called down rapidly and accurately, often within minutes of a request. Infantry and armour trained together and understood how to support each other. Tank destroyers, specialist vehicles designed for defensive anti-tank work, could be positioned to create killing zones. Above all, American forces could call upon overwhelming air power once weather permitted. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt could deliver devastating attacks on enemy armour, and the Allies had achieved near-total air supremacy by this stage of the war. The terrain of Lorraine itself played a significant role in shaping what would occur. The region is characterized by gently rolling hills, small rivers and streams, patches of forest, and numerous villages connected by narrow roads. This was not the open tank country of the Eastern Front where German armour had operated most effectively. Instead, the landscape offered numerous positions for defence, places where smaller forces could establish ambush positions or fighting positions that negated the range advantage of German guns. The villages, with their stone buildings and walled gardens, provided cover and concealment. The small valleys and ridgelines created dead zones where tanks could move unseen until they were at close range. As September progressed, American intelligence began picking up indications of German preparations for a major attack. Reconnaissance patrols reported increased enemy activity across the Moselle. Pilots flying observation missions spotted signs of armour concentrations, though cloud cover often limited visibility. Within the 4th Armoured Division, commanders began preparing their units for what seemed likely to come. Ammunition was distributed and stockpiled at forward positions. Artillery units registered their guns on likely approach routes and established communication with forward observers. Tank platoons were assigned defensive sectors and reconnaissance routes. Infantry dug foxholes and established outpost lines. The veterans among the troops recognized the signs. Something was building. The men waiting in those positions were products of America's wartime mobilization. They came from farms and cities, from every region of the country. Many were young, barely out of their teens, but months of combat had aged them in ways that no calendar could measure. They had learned to function in the chaos of battle, to follow orders while also improvising when situations demanded it. The tank crews had developed the kind of rapport that only comes from living and fighting in the cramped confines of an armoured vehicle. Commanders knew their gunners' capabilities. Drivers understood exactly how their particular tank handled. Loaders could keep shells feeding into the breech with mechanical efficiency even under fire. Life in a Sherman during these waiting periods was a mixture of boredom and tension. Crews performed endless maintenance on their vehicles, checking tracks, cleaning guns, testing radios. They ate cold rations and tried to sleep in whatever shelter they could find, often curled up beneath the hull of their tank. Some wrote letters home, carefully avoiding any specifics about their location or activities that might be caught by censors. Others simply sat and smoked, talking quietly about anything except what might be coming. The veterans among them had developed a kind of fatalism. They would fight when the time came, do their jobs, and hope their luck held. Dwelling on the possibilities served no purpose. The German forces gathering for the attack were experiencing very different circumstances. The newly formed panzer brigades had been rushed to the front with inadequate preparation. Many of the crews had never worked together before being assigned to their vehicles. The Panthers they received were often fresh from factories, lacking the minor adjustments and repairs that experienced crews would have made during a proper break-in period. Fuel was already a concern before operations even began. The allocation of gasoline to frontline units had become increasingly problematic as Allied bombing disrupted German production and transportation networks. More critically, these German units lacked the reconnaissance capabilities that had once been a hallmark of German armoured operations. In the early war years, panzer divisions had included robust reconnaissance battalions equipped with armoured cars and motorcycles, units that would scout ahead of the main force and provide detailed information about enemy positions and terrain. By 1944, these reconnaissance elements had been depleted and were often absent entirely from the hastily formed brigades. This meant that German commanders would be advancing with only the vaguest knowledge of what lay ahead, essentially groping forward into the fog both literally and figuratively. The evening of September 18th brought with it a weather system that would prove decisive. Fog settled across Lorraine, thick and persistent, reducing visibility to almost nothing in many areas. German officers saw this as advantageous, believing it would conceal their advance from American observation posts and, critically, from Allied aircraft. The plan called for the panzer brigades to advance under cover of this fog, achieve tactical surprise, and overwhelm American positions before coordinated resistance could be organized. The first major thrust would be delivered by the 113th Panzer Brigade, a formation built around a core of Panther tanks supported by Panzer Grenadiers in half-tracks. What the Germans did not know was that American positions were better prepared than they assumed. Combat Command A of the 4th Armoured Division, under the leadership of experienced officers who understood the ground they were defending, had established a defensive network that took advantage of the terrain. Tank platoons occupied positions with good fields of fire and covered approaches. Tank destroyers with their powerful guns were positioned in hull-down positions where only their turrets showed. Artillery forward observers had already plotted likely enemy approach routes. Perhaps most importantly, the American forces had functioning radio communications that allowed for rapid coordination between units. When dawn broke on September 19th, the fog lay so thick across the landscape that men standing next to their tanks could barely see the vehicle. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards in many places. Out of this murk came the sound that every veteran recognized, the deep rumble of approaching armor. The German advance had begun. The 113th Panzer Brigade was moving forward, its Panthers advancing in column along roads and tracks, confident that the fog concealed them from enemy observation. But the fog proved to be a double-edged weapon. While it did prevent American aircraft from operating and obscured long-range observation, it also reduced the Panthers' primary advantage. The German tanks' superior guns were designed for long-range engagement, for picking off enemy vehicles at distances where return fire would be ineffective. In the fog, ranges collapsed to a few hundred yards or less. Suddenly, Sherman crews found themselves in situations where their 75mm guns could penetrate Panther armor, particularly from the flanks or rear. The first contact came suddenly and violently. American tank platoons, waiting in concealed positions, saw the dark silhouettes of Panthers emerge from the white curtain of fog. At ranges of 200 yards or less, American gunners opened fire. The initial volleys caught German crews completely by surprise. Several Panthers immediately burst into flame, their crews scrambling to escape the inferno. The German column, advancing in good order just moments before, dissolved into chaos. Commanders tried to deploy their vehicles from march column into combat formation, but in the fog, units became separated and confused. Radio communications, never the German army's strongest point, broke down as units lost contact with each other. American forces maneuvered with the discipline that came from training and experience. Tank platoons shifted positions after firing, relocating before German return fire could find them. Tank destroyers engaged from prepared positions, then displaced to alternate firing positions already selected and ranged. Artillery fire began falling on German formations, directed by forward observers who used brief gaps in the fog to spot targets. The battle quickly became a close-range brawl in which American advantages in coordination and tactical flexibility outweighed German advantages in armor and firepower. Near the village of Lise, one of the most intense engagements of the opening day developed. A company of Panthers attempted to push through American positions, advancing with supporting infantry. They ran headlong into tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, vehicles mounting powerful 90mm guns. At point-blank range, these weapons could penetrate even a Panther's frontal armor. The exchange of fire was brutal and brief. 3 American tank destroyers were knocked out, their crews killed or wounded. But before the German advance could continue, 7 Panthers had been reduced to burning hulks. The destroyed vehicles blocked the narrow road, preventing other German tanks from advancing. Throughout that first day, similar engagements erupted across the battlefield. German commanders, unable to see the full picture through the fog and hampered by poor communications, continued to push their units forward piecemeal. American defenders, operating in a coordinated defensive network with excellent radio links, concentrated fire on each German thrust as it materialized. By evening, when units finally pulled back to assess the day's results, the 113th Panzer Brigade had been savaged. Roughly 50 of its tanks had been destroyed or damaged so severely they had to be abandoned. The brigade's combat power had been cut in half in a single day's fighting. The following day, September 20th, saw the Germans attempt to renew their offensive despite the losses suffered. Additional units were committed, including elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade. The attacks focused on the area around Arracourt itself, where American headquarters elements were located. For a time, the situation became critical. German armor pushed forward aggressively, and American units found themselves under heavy pressure. Panthers advanced to within a few hundred yards of Combat Command A's command post. The headquarters personnel, clerks and staff officers grabbed whatever weapons were available and prepared to defend themselves. It was at this desperate moment that an unlikely saviour appeared in the skies above. Major Charles Carpenter was an artillery officer assigned as an aerial observer, flying a tiny Piper L-4 Grasshopper, essentially a militarized version of a civilian light aircraft. These small, fragile planes were typically used for artillery spotting and battlefield observation. But Carpenter had been experimenting with a modification that seemed almost ludicrous. He had attached bazookas to the wings of his aircraft, creating an improvised ground attack capability. As Carpenter circled overhead and observed the German tanks threatening the American headquarters, he made the decision to attack. Diving toward the advancing Panthers in his slow, unarmed spotter plane took courage that bordered on madness. The bazookas mounted on his wings were never designed for aerial use, and their accuracy from a moving aircraft was questionable at best. Yet Carpenter pressed his attack, firing rocket after rocket at the German column below. Against all odds, his rockets found targets. 2 Panthers were knocked out, their crews abandoning the vehicles. Several armoured cars were destroyed. More importantly, the unexpected attack from above created confusion and panic among the German infantry advancing with the tanks. Carpenter returned to the American airstrip, rearmed his makeshift weapons, and immediately flew 2 more sorties against the German forces. By the end of the day, he had fired 16 rockets in total, and his tiny grasshopper had inflicted more damage on German armour than anyone would have believed possible. His actions, while they did not turn the tide of battle by themselves, bought precious time for American ground forces to reorganize and bring up reinforcements. The story of Rosie the Rocketer, as Carpenter had nicknamed his aircraft, spread rapidly through American ranks and provided a tremendous boost to morale. The weather on September 21st finally began to clear. The fog that had dominated the battlefield for days thinned and eventually lifted. Blue sky appeared overhead, and with it came the full weight of Allied air power. The 9th Tactical Air Command, which had been grounded by the weather, now unleashed its fighter bombers against the exposed German columns. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, each carrying bombs, rockets, and heavy machine guns, roared over the battlefield in waves. German tanks and vehicles, caught in open country without air cover, became helpless targets. The impact of air power on armoured vehicles should not be overstated. Direct hits from fighter-bomber attacks rarely destroyed tanks outright. But the psychological effect was devastating, and even near misses could damage tracks, periscopes, or other external equipment. More critically, the constant presence of prowling Allied aircraft made movement in daylight nearly suicidal for German forces. Columns had to disperse and hide, destroying unit cohesion. Supply trucks and fuel tankers, absolutely vital for keeping armoured units operational, were particularly vulnerable and suffered heavy losses. German commanders found themselves unable to concentrate their forces or manoeuvre effectively under the constant threat from above. September 22nd brought the climax of the battle. German forces made one more major attempt to break through American lines north of Arracourt. The 111th Panzer Brigade, supported by remaining elements of the 113th, gathered for what would prove to be their final offensive effort. Once again, morning fog provided initial concealment for the attack. The assault fell first on American cavalry units, light reconnaissance forces equipped with armoured cars and light tanks. These units were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with desperate determination, holding their positions long enough to allow heavier American forces to respond. As the German advance developed, the fog began to lift. American artillery, already alerted and registered on likely target areas, opened up with devastating effect. Shells rained down on German formations, creating casualties among the accompanying infantry and forcing tanks to button up, reducing their visibility even further. Sherman tanks and tank destroyers moved into prepared firing positions, engaging the Germans from ranges where they could penetrate Panther armour. Allied aircraft appeared overhead as the weather cleared, adding their firepower to the battle. The fighting reached a crescendo of violence as German forces attempted to push through the coordinated American defence. Panthers that survived the artillery barrages found themselves under fire from multiple directions. American doctrine emphasized firing from concealed positions, hitting German vehicles from the flank or rear whenever possible, then displacing before return fire could be effective. German crews, many of whom were fighting in their first major engagement, found themselves overwhelmed by the intensity and coordination of the American response. Tank after tank ground to a halt, penetrated by American shells, or burst into flames as ammunition exploded. Panzer grenadiers caught in open ground were cut down by machine gun fire and artillery fragments. By afternoon, the German attack had completely broken down. Units that had advanced in good order hours before were now scattered and disorganized. Many tanks had been abandoned by their crews, who fled on foot rather than remain in vehicles that had become death traps. American forces, sensing the collapse, launched counterattacks from the flanks, rolling up what remained of the German formations. The 111th Panzer Brigade, like the 113th before it, had been shattered. The counter-offensive that Hitler had demanded, the attack that was supposed to drive Patton's Third Army back and restore German fortunes, had instead turned into a catastrophe. Throughout these desperate days of fighting, certain American units and commanders distinguished themselves particularly. The 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, fought with exceptional skill and aggressiveness. Abrams was a natural leader, aggressive but not reckless, always seeming to appear where the crisis was greatest. His battalion operated with a coordination and efficiency that reflected both training and combat experience. During the period from September 19th through the 22nd, the 37th Tank Battalion lost 14 Sherman tanks but destroyed a staggering 55 German armoured vehicles, mostly Panthers and Tigers. This was an exchange ratio that defied all expectations based on the technical specifications of the vehicles involved. Abrams himself led from the front, his command tank often at the point of his battalion's advances. His ability to read the battlefield, to sense where opportunities existed and where dangers lurked, became almost legendary among his men. He understood instinctively how to use terrain, how to coordinate with supporting arms, and how to maintain pressure on an enemy without overextending his own forces. Stories of his exploits spread throughout the 4th Armoured Division and beyond. His name became synonymous with American armoured prowess, and his reputation would only grow in the months and years ahead. The intensity of the fighting during those September days cannot be fully captured in casualty statistics or lists of destroyed vehicles. Inside the tanks, crews endured conditions of tremendous stress and discomfort. The interior of a Sherman in combat was cramped, noisy, and filled with the acrid smell of propellant and oil. Communication between crew members required shouting over the roar of the engine and the clatter of tracks. When a tank was hit, even if the shell failed to penetrate, the impact rang through the hull like a hammer striking an anvil. Crews never knew if the next hit would be the one that penetrated, igniting ammunition or fuel and turning their vehicle into a furnace. Those who had seen tanks brew up, had watched the smoke pouring from hatches, and had heard the screams of men trapped inside, carried those images with them every time they buttoned up their own hatches. For the Germans, the experience was, if anything, more traumatic. Many of the crews manning the Panthers were so inexperienced that they had never fired their main guns in combat before arriving at Lorraine. The shock of suddenly finding themselves in close-range engagements, taking fire from multiple directions, surrounded by burning vehicles and dying comrades, was overwhelming. Training, no matter how intensive, cannot fully prepare soldiers for the reality of combat. These young Germans, many still teenagers, found themselves in a nightmare of explosions, screaming, and terror. Those who survived the destruction of their vehicles often had to make their way back to German lines on foot, through countryside controlled by American forces, watching the skies for prowling fighter bombers. By September 25th, German offensive operations had effectively ceased. A few scattered attacks were launched in subsequent days, but these were weak, uncoordinated efforts that accomplished nothing beyond adding to the casualty lists. The once mighty armoured thrust that Hitler had envisioned had been annihilated. Across the fields and roads of Lorraine, 285 German tanks and armoured vehicles lay destroyed or abandoned. Many were Panthers that had been proclaimed invincible by German propaganda. Some were Tigers, even more heavily armoured and feared. All had proven vulnerable to coordinated defence, to skilled crews, and to the combined application of artillery, armour and air power. American losses, by comparison, were remarkably light. 25 Sherman tanks and 7 tank destroyers had been knocked out during the battle. Some of these had been recovered and repaired, returning to service within days. The disparity in the exchange ratio was so extreme that some historians would later question the figures, assuming they must have been exaggerated for propaganda purposes. But the numbers have been verified through multiple sources, German and American both. The Battle of Arracourt really was as lopsided as it appeared. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw profound shock ripple through German command structures. Reports reaching higher headquarters described a level of destruction that seemed almost impossible to believe. Entire brigades had been wiped out in less than a week of fighting. The Panthers that had been expected to dominate the battlefield had instead become scattered wrecks across French farmland. Hitler, predictably, responded with fury. Commanders were relieved, including Johannes Blaskowitz, the commander of Army Group G. The relief of commanders did nothing to change the fundamental realities. Germany had gambled precious armoured resources on an offensive that had not only failed, but had catastrophically weakened its defensive capabilities in the region. For Patton and the Third Army, Arracourt represented both triumph and frustration. The victory had demonstrated conclusively that American forces could meet and defeat the best Germany had to offer. The Sherman, so often derided as inferior, had proven itself when wielded by trained crews operating within proper doctrine. The coordination between ground and air forces had worked exactly as envisioned. Yet the Third Army's advance remained stalled not by German resistance, but by logistics. Fuel and ammunition, diverted to support other operations, particularly Montgomery's thrust in the north, were simply not available in sufficient quantities. The door into Germany lay tantalizingly open, but Patton lacked the supplies to drive through it. The soldiers who had fought at Arracourt understood that they had participated in something significant. Word of the victory spread through letters home, through newspaper reports, and through the stories told and retold among the troops themselves. For the men of the 4th Armoured Division, Arracourt became a defining moment in their unit's history, a battle that validated their training, their tactics, and their courage. They had faced what was supposed to be the finest German armour and had comprehensively defeated it. The strategic consequences of Arracourt extended well beyond the immediate tactical situation in Lorraine. For the German military, the battle represented another in a series of devastating blows to the Panzerwaffe. The losses in tanks were severe, but the loss of trained personnel was even more critical. Each destroyed Panther meant not just a piece of equipment lost, but an experienced crew killed or captured at a time when Germany could ill afford such losses. The replacement tanks and crews that would eventually filter to the front would be of even lower quality, accelerating the overall decline in German armoured capability. The battle also affected German defensive planning for the campaigns that lay ahead. The resources squandered at Arracourt, the fuel burned, the ammunition expended, the tanks destroyed, all represented capabilities that would not be available when Patton's forces eventually resumed their advance. The Siegfried Line, Germany's prepared defensive position on its western border, would be weakened by the absence of mobile reserves that might have been available had they not been thrown away in Lorraine. Every German military planner understood that the war was now defensive in nature, that Germany was fighting for survival rather than victory. Yet resources continued to be wasted on counter-offensive operations that had no realistic chance of success. For American doctrine and planning, Arracourt provided powerful validation. The emphasis on combined arms, on coordination between different branches of service, had proven its worth decisively. The system that allowed tank units to call in artillery strikes within minutes, that enabled air support to be directed onto targets almost in real time, that coordinated infantry, armour and tank destroyers into a cohesive defensive network, this system had worked exactly as intended. Future operations would build on these lessons, refining and improving the coordination until it became second nature to American forces. The human stories emerging from Arracourt added to its significance. Charles Carpenter and his rocket-armed observation plane became the subject of newspaper articles and magazine features. His improvisation and courage captured public imagination, providing the kind of individual heroism story that helped maintain support for the war effort on the home front. Creighton Abrams emerged from the battle as one of America's premier armoured commanders, his reputation growing with each subsequent engagement. Decades later, when the US Army developed a new main battle tank to replace the M60, they would name it the M1 Abrams, a testament to the legacy of the man who had so distinguished himself in the fog-shrouded fields of Lorraine. For ordinary soldiers, the ones whose names would not appear in history books, Arracourt remained a personal memory of survival and shared hardship. They remembered the fog, the sudden eruptions of gunfire, the concussive blast of shells hitting nearby, the relief of seeing enemy tanks burning instead of their own. They remembered comrades who had not survived, men they had trained with, fought alongside, and lost. Years later, at reunions and veterans' gatherings, they would tell stories about those September days, stories that grew more polished with each retelling, but that still carried the emotional weight of lived experience. The tactical lessons of Arracourt were studied intensely by military professionals in the years that followed. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory. The Panther was objectively the better tank in terms of armour protection and firepower, yet it had been defeated comprehensively by an apparently inferior opponent. Analysis of the battle highlighted several key factors that explained this paradox. First, the quality and training of crews mattered enormously. Experienced American tankers, who understood their equipment and knew how to work together as a team, proved far more effective than inexperienced Germans handed sophisticated equipment. Second, doctrine and tactics could overcome hardware advantages. American emphasis on maneuver, on combined arms, on using terrain intelligently, negated many of the Panther's inherent advantages. Third, coordination and communication proved decisive. American radio networks, forward observer systems, and command structures allowed for rapid concentration of force at critical points. German forces, fragmented and unable to coordinate effectively, were defeated in detail. The weather's role in the battle also received considerable attention from military analysts. The fog had been intended by German planners to provide concealment for their advance. Instead, it had neutralized their primary advantage in long-range firepower, while allowing American forces to engage at closer ranges where their guns were effective. When the weather cleared, Allied air power had proven utterly dominant, inflicting both physical damage and psychological disruption on German forces. The lesson seemed clear that modern warfare required control of the skies, and that attacking forces lacking air superiority faced nearly insurmountable disadvantages. From a broader perspective, Arracourt marked a point in the war where Allied forces had clearly surpassed their German opponents in overall combat effectiveness. The early war years had seen German forces consistently outfighting Allied opponents through superior tactics, leadership, and coordination. By autumn 1944, that advantage had evaporated. American, British, and Canadian forces had learned from their defeats, had adapted their doctrine, and had developed systems that worked. The material advantages they had always enjoyed in terms of industrial production, now combined with equal or superior tactical performance, made Allied victory inevitable, barring some dramatic reversal of fortune. Germany's strategic situation by late September 1944 had become desperate. On the Eastern Front, Soviet armies were driving into Poland and the Balkans. In Italy, Allied forces continued their slow grind northward. In the West, despite the temporary halt caused by supply shortages, Allied armies stood poised to invade Germany itself. The Kriegsmarine had been driven from the seas, unable to contest Allied control of the oceans. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, unable to protect German cities from devastating bomber raids or to support ground forces in the field. German war production, despite desperate efforts by Albert Speer's organization, could not keep pace with losses. The human cost had been catastrophic, with millions of German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured on multiple fronts. Yet the Nazi leadership refused to accept reality. Hitler's response to each defeat was to demand counterattacks, to insist that willpower alone could overcome material disadvantages. This fundamentally irrational approach to strategy would continue until the final days of the war, squandering what remained of Germany's military strength in offensives that had no chance of success. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, often called the Battle of the Bulge, would be the last and largest of these futile gestures. Like the Lorraine counter-offensive before it, the Ardennes attack would achieve initial surprise and some tactical success before being ground down by Allied material superiority and tactical proficiency. The memory of Arracourt faded somewhat in the months that followed as larger battles captured public attention. The fighting in the Hürtgen forest, the airborne disaster at Arnhem, and particularly the Battle of the Bulge all overshadowed Lorraine in the public consciousness. Yet for military professionals and historians, Arracourt remained a fascinating case study in how battles could be won against apparently superior opponents. The engagement demonstrated principles that would remain relevant for decades to come, that coordination matters more than individual weapons capabilities, that training and experience can overcome hardware disadvantages, and that combined arms integration represents the future of land warfare. The physical landscape of Lorraine gradually recovered from the battle. Farmers returned to their fields, carefully ploughing around the remains of destroyed vehicles until salvage crews could remove them. Villages rebuilt their damaged structures. The scars of war, the shell craters and burned buildings slowly disappeared under new construction and returning vegetation. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the battlefield had already begun its transformation back to peaceful countryside. But the significance of what had happened there endured. Military academies would teach the battle as an example of proper defensive operations and combined arms coordination. Veterans would remember it as the moment when they proved to themselves and to the world that they could match and defeat the best their enemy could offer. The families of those who fell there would remember it as the place where fathers, sons and brothers gave their lives in a cause they believed was just. Historians would analyse it as a turning point, a moment when the last remnants of German offensive capability in the West were broken beyond repair. In the end, Arracourt stood as a testament to certain fundamental truths about warfare. Battles are not won by machines alone, but by the men who operate them. Superior technology provides an advantage, certainly, but that advantage can be negated by superior tactics, better coordination, and more experienced personnel. The side that can effectively integrate all its available resources, that can coordinate ground and air forces, armour and infantry, firepower and manoeuvre, that side possesses an advantage that no amount of armour plating can overcome. The German Panthers had represented the pinnacle of German tank design, incorporating lessons learned from years of combat. Yet in the fog of Lorraine, they had fallen to crews in Shermans who understood that warfare was ultimately about teamwork, adaptability, and the intelligent application of force. The story of Arracourt deserves to be remembered not just as another battle in a war filled with battles, but as an illustration of how determination, skill, and proper doctrine can triumph over apparently insurmountable odds. The American tank crews who fought there faced an enemy equipped with technically superior weapons. They fought anyway, using intelligence and courage to overcome disadvantage. They proved that in the end, it is not the strongest weapon that wins battles, but the strongest will guided by the clearest thinking. That lesson, forged in the fog and fire of a French autumn, remains as relevant today as it was on those desperate September days in 1944.